So welcome everybody to this joint meeting of the Popular Culture, Sport and Leisure History Seminar and a Life Cycle Seminar. Very nice to get a chance, it's not the first time, but very nice to again get a chance to, it's actually our third joint seminar actually. Very nice to once again kind of have a chance to kind of get the groups together as a representative of both. Our speaker today is Dr. Paul Hodkinson from the University of Surrey. Paul is a reader in the Department of Sociology at Surrey. His publications include Goth, Identity, Style and Subculture, and Media, Culture and Society, an Introduction. He also co-edited Youth Cultures, Scenes, Subcultures and Tribes, and Aging and Youth Cultures, Music, Style and Identity. Today he's going to be talking a bit about that kind of, about his work on aging and subcultures, looking specifically at Goths, which a lot of his work has been on. So his title today of his paper is Subcultural Growing Up, a Re-Embrace of Dominant Gender Codes. So, Paul.
Thank you very much for having me. It's really nice to be here. I did my first bit of research on Goths at the end of the 90s. And that was my PhD, and ended up in the book Goth. And then I think it must have been about 10, 11 years later, I can't remember, I think it was a colleague of mine, Andy Bennett, was doing some research on ageing punks, and it sort of resonated with lots of things that I've been sort of seeing in the Goth scene. And specifically the way in which people were remaining involved apparently later and later into their sort of initially 20s, then 30s, then some into their 40s and 50s and so on. And Andy's work on ageing punks in Canterbury, I think it was, and he was sort of writing about the way in which there's this sort of group of older punks at this sort of local gig venue in Canterbury, and they all sort of stand at the back, and they're the sort of elder statesmen watching all the kids sort of moshing at the front kind of thing. And that got me sort of thinking about whether there might be something interesting that I could do in relation to Goth. So I suppose I sort of went back really into the field, as it were, and interviewed, I think it was 19 people, a number of whom, probably about, I think 10 of whom were also people that I'd interviewed in the original study as well. So I was able to do that, I suppose, sort of longitudinal kind of thing, although there was a rather large gap between the two times to see where they were now and what they were doing and what their level of involvement in the scene was. And how that was connecting with the rest of their life as an adult or a not adult or whatever it was that they were. So I guess maybe the starting point, this is going to be a very not theoretical talk, this is going to be very much me throwing lots of interview quotes at you and seeing what you make of it, I think, but just in terms of very sort of basic sort of theory about youth and adulthood and so on, you'll probably be familiar with the notion that youth has for a long time been thought of as this kind of short transitional period between childhood dependence and adulthood responsibilities. And Talcott Parsons, sort of famous sort of classic sociologist, sort of writes about youth and youth culture specifically as this kind of emotional release for those that are between the family that they grew up in, where they're sort of dependent on their parents and so on, and their eventual sort of family that they become involved in after their period of youth, where they get married and have children in that kind of classical model. So short period of time where you do lots of sort of weird stuff and rebel a bit and very quite familiar sort of a theory which has been much repeated in media and elsewhere. And another sort of area of research that sometimes my work sort of comes in relation to is youth transitions research, which kind of looks, I suppose it looks at the period of youth as a sort of journey between childhood defined in particular ways, in adulthood defined in particular ways, and particularly is focused upon the factors that prompt people to have a successful transition to a good job, for example, a good career. And some people take that into a transition towards, kind of a sustainable housing arrangements, sustainable ways of life. Again, there, I think. Youth is being regarded as this sort of short transitional phase, and which probably isn't that important, except for whether you manage to get to the other end successfully, kind of thing. And part of the successful other end, I think, probably still is this notion of a stable family, whether implicitly or explicitly. And probably that in most cases there's a sort of nuclear family, 2.4 children or whatever the right phrase is. So, the stable heterosexual family in that way is the kind of end point to a successful youth transition. And crucially, it's the end point. So that means all the kind of rebellious nonsense that you got up to when you were young kind of stops at that point, or that's the kind of classic assumption. And as part of that, I think that there's then an assumption that specifically sexually transgressive aspects of youth, which are one aspect of sort of rebellious youth that's sometimes been studied, most notably in the 60s, but also in other periods too, that they too, in some cases at least, fit into that category of sort of transitory youthful phase, and then come to an end at the point that adulthood is sort of reached, and you then get married, have children, have a stable career, and all the rest. I suppose I probably should have had a fourth point on there, which is, I guess, subcultural theories about youth, subculture specifically. I think more implicitly than explicitly, maybe, but there's been a sort of a bit of an assumption there as well, I think, that youth subcultures can be explained as a result of being in that very particular period of the life course, and that the reason people become involved in the various spectacular activities associated with being a punk or being a goth or whatever it might be has something to do with being whatever that age bracket is, 16 to 21 or however you define it. So just sort of bearing that sort of background stuff in mind, part of my question, I suppose, today, and in relation to the project that I did, is what to make of people that become involved in such a subculture, and in some cases, probably fairly many cases, are involved in a fair degree of sort of gender transgression, sexual transgression, and so on during that period of time to start with. Then, instead of sort of stopping being involved in that subculture, they just kind of continue their involvement throughout their 20s, then into their 30s, and then in some cases into their 40s and beyond. And I suppose particularly interestingly to me, doing so at least by the time that they're in their 30s, alongside the taking on of various of those adulthood responsibilities. So alongside having sort of fairly, respectable career-type middle-class jobs, for example, and in some cases getting married, and in some cases becoming parents, and all the rest, alongside remaining involved in this supposedly transgressive subculture. Brief introduction to Goth and the Goth scene. People might or might not know this, but Goth sort of emerged in the wake of punk, really. So punk happens in the sort of late 70s, and then kind of dies down a bit towards the end of the 70s, and then there's a few sort of disparate little things going on in the early 80s, and Goth eventually sort of manages to sort of emerge as a fairly coherent sort of a scene or subculture. Probably by the mid-80s, I think people were calling it by name on a regular basis. I think probably before that, and some people sort of talked about post-punk and different parts of post-punk and so on. Gradually it sort of coalesces around a sort of fairly kind of distinctive set of dark themes, and in both the music and the style. And I can obviously sort of go into a bit more detail about that if anyone would like me to, but just by way of introduction, that's probably enough. And unlike some scenes and subcultures, it's kind of survived for a long time. So, you know, sort of 3 decades old, really, more than 3 decades old. I suppose punk is another example of one that's sort of survived that long. There's 1 or 2 others, but there's a number of other sort of scenes that have sort of come and gone and never come back again. In many ways, goth has a lot of the hallmarks of a sort of classic hedonistic youth subculture, at least to start with. So, you know, centred upon a number of the things that other subcultures are centred upon. Kind of going out, getting drunk, taking drugs, sometimes late nights, getting dressed up, quite a lot of the things that you'd often sort of associate with that kind of thing, and which in some ways contrast with the normal adult world, and you know, part of the appeal of it, I think, to many people that first become involved in it is that contrast to the quote unquote normal adult world, including the family. There's also specific forms of transgression in goth in relation to gender and sexuality, I think. Sometimes these are exaggerated, and it's sort of tricky because the goth scene was always a little bit diverse. But, for example, it was quite common for goth males, and it still is, in fact, to wear makeup, to look very feminine, to wear clothes which are quite tight-fitting, sometimes even to wear skirts, dresses, that kind of thing. And so this person that was part of my initial study says, I think that the nature of goth culture in itself is conducive to femininity, in that sexual ambiguity is expressed with the clothes that make up the music of the scene, and there's like an explicit connection there between sort of sexuality potentially and a particular kind of veering towards what many understand as a kind of dark femininity, I suppose, among both men and women. So it's kind of often referred to as an androgynous scene, but some people have pointed out quite rightly that actually it's sort of androgynous for men, but probably not androgynous for women. Yeah, so these are a few images from my original study of, guys putting on lots of makeup and, long hair, crimped hair in this case, lots of jewellery. And in terms of body shape and so on, it's a scene which sort of really sort of venerates very thin, sort of slender men. And I think some people talk to me as well about, it being a place where it was possible to be a man that would sort of express their emotions a lot, and that it felt like a safe space to occupy in that respect. So yeah, not everybody looked like this ever. So there was a kind of slightly more masculine goth look in the past, I'd say, but certainly there was a lot of men that were wearing lots of makeup and having long hair and looking this kind of look. On the other side, a lot of people have talked as well, who've written about goth, have talked about kind of the sort of dominatrix look for goth women. So in some ways it's a sort of hyper-femininity, it's sometimes referred to as kind of dark hyper-femininity, but there's also a kind of powerfulness to it in various respects. So you've got Susie Sue here from Susie and the Banshees, Patricia Morrison, who at one point was with the Sisters of Mercy, who were, sort of real sort of venerated women within the scene, and lots of people sort of adopted looks that were quite similar to that. So some people have written quite a lot about that too. I guess the broader influence on goth of fetishism, and so fetish style, and I've got sort of image here of just kind of goth kind of appropriating, if you like, sort of dog collars, leather, PVC, chains, that kind of thing from fetish style, as punk did before it to some extent. But also many goths actually taking on elements in practice of sort of fetishistic approaches to sexuality, bisexuality, elements of sort of BDSM in their sexual practice and their sexual identities. Again, not everybody. So some goths sort of very much kind of monogamous heterosexual relationships was pretty much all they did, and that was what they did. But in general, as an environment, it was an environment in which it was very common to see, sort of open bisexuality, for example, in goth clubs and stuff. And many people, when I talk to them, would talk about fetishism and BDSM sometimes being a sort of important part of their identity, and some people also attended those kinds of nights separately from goth nights too. So some people it was more of a stylistic thing, the whole fetish thing, but some were undoubtedly sort of taking that on. More generally, I suppose, perhaps like many other youth cultures, that a great deal of sort of promiscuity and lots of people sort of having sex with lots of different people on different occasions and so on. Perhaps not so unusual, but sort of an important part of the culture nonetheless. For some commentators then, for example, Carol Siegel, who wrote a book called Goth's Dark Empire, all of this in terms of what participants are doing, together with what's going on within Gothic texts of various kinds, whether it's vampire fiction or whether it's various other elements of imagery and literature and so on, is pointing towards this kind of quite transgressive subcultural movement, which is undermining established categories of gender and sexuality in various ways. I'm not sort of entirely signed up to Carol Siegel's kind of version of things for particular reasons. But I do think it's fair to say that there was and probably is a degree of sexual transgression there that was significant, and that goth spaces were interesting spaces and environments in that respect in terms of a very genuinely different sort of set of norms. Okay, so that's kind of background. What happens when people are 30 or 40 is my kind of question, to put it really bluntly. So I did a very small scale project, classic attempt to get funding, failed to get funding, get a very small amount of internal funding, and just literally sort of went off and did a number of interviews and got them transcribed and so on. And yeah, I'll just sort of jump straight in there, really, with telling you about some of the things that people said. So in the original research in the late 90s, in terms of housing arrangements, most people were in shared houses, renting, living with their parents. One or two were in couples that had bought houses and so on, but that was the sort of exception rather than the rule, really. As you might expect, I guess, for a kind of youth culture of that kind. And in terms of relationship status, it was kind of mixed. There were a number of people who did have a sort of partner that was, that they'd been with for more than a few months, but probably not that many that were with a partner that had been with for several years, for example. So most people, there's an element of sort of fluidity in their kind of relationship status. A number of people sort of regarding themselves as bisexual and talking about sort of bisexual relationships, and also elements of fetishism and so on. Not for everybody, but for a reasonable number of people. In the subsequent research, it's really striking. Obviously, it's not a representative sample. It's only a sample of sort of 19 people. But the vast majority owned their own homes, had a mortgage, and most were also in long-term heterosexual relationships, many of whom were married, and an increasing number had children, or were talking about having children in the future and wanted to have children in the future. So again, perhaps not surprisingly, I was deliberately trying to look at people who were a bit older and who weren't in that sort of younger category. But what interested me is okay, so how does that affect your participation in the scene, and how does your participation in the scene affect those other things in your life and the way in which they're operating? So yes, an embrace of monogamy and parenthood, gradual. And actually, since I did the research more, I think it's fair to say that the number of people that have become parents has sort of fairly dramatically increased, even since then. And parenthood, as you would expect, affects quite drastically people's intensity of participation. So even if they're still identifying very strongly as goths, the amount that they're going out, the lateness with which they're going out, and everything else reduces quite considerably. So this is like really, not surprising and common statement from Matthew's 43. But again, you're back to the point with that when you go back, the next morning you're going to get up at 7:30 in the morning, because you think, I can't do that, get drunk, because I've got to get carried to this, that, or the other. So lots of people talking about, just sort of little things. So drinking less, going out, for a bit less long, making sure you drive, and that meaning then that you don't drink as well, and driving back. Just lots of different aspects of the night out becoming a bit different than they were. And also, a bit less easy to sort of spend ages getting ready if there's a child in the house that needs sort of taking care of until the babysitter arrives or whatever. So lots of people who were parents talking about that kind of thing. And again, previously, I think it was the case that parenthood would have resulted in kind of almost total abandonment of the scene. But what's interesting is that you've got this kind of continuing to identify quite strongly with the scene, but nevertheless having to tone various things down and reduce intensity in various ways. This kind of parenthood thing also is interesting because it becomes a kind of collectively talked about thing in the scene as a whole. So it's not just sort of some individual people doing it. It's kind of a phenomenon, like an internal phenomenon within the scene. Some people even sort of joking about a goth baby boom, like, everyone's doing it, like it's like a sort of fashion trend within the scene that you have to have a little goth baby or that kind of thing. And in a kind of fairly sort of self-conscious way. But showing that this is it's like a collective phenomenon, that there's a cohort of people here that's sort of getting to a certain age, I guess. And there are younger people who are coming in as well to some extent, but there are enough older people that it is a phenomenon within the scene as a whole. So collective drift to family and parenthood. And so this person says, I don't know whether it's the fact that goths want to hang on to their youth as long as possible, or whether they're all of a mindset they don't want kids. They're the eternally young. And then their body clock starts going tick, 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 and let's do it now. But I found all of a sudden a lot of people kind of between 35 and 40 are having a child now. And I think actually that's not entirely unusual to goths either. I think that's probably true of a particular generation of people that many of them sort of left it till their 30s to have children. And many of them, I think that probably quite accurately describes that people start to realise that there's only a certain period of time where this is possible, safe, likely to work, and so on. And just this is sort of just illustrating this being a talked about thing. People start blogging about this as a phenomenon. Lots of people seem to have babies these days, and I'm going to write about it, even though I'm not one of those people. And people commenting on it and so on. So it is like this sort of phenomenon. And they even become sort of institutionalized, I suppose, to the extent that people who are organising events and festivals and various other things start to adapt a little bit to the knowledge that people attending their events may bring children to their events and want to know what they can do with their children and that kind of thing. So this is just like a little field note that I wrote So a male goth, perhaps 35, long hair, black clothes, fairly standard, non-elaborate jeans, t-shirt, trad goth look. That means a sort of like a 1980s-ish goth look. But carrying a baby in a front sling, approaches the info desk and inquires as to whether it's okay to bring his baby to the evening event, which is like a gig with sort of lots of bands playing and so on. And they've actually got an answer. They know what to answer when people ask this, because they've had to sort of now take that into account, whereas previously it would have been unthinkable that they would even be asked such a thing. And the answer is yes, you can, as long as you've got ear protectors. Otherwise, you have to keep them in the other sort of room away from the bands and so on. One year, this particular festival put on a crash as well, I think, and I'm not sure actually it was that successful, so I'm not sure they did it again. But again, it shows that they were thinking about trying to cater for this older group of people that now have got babies and children and all of that kind of thing. Tom here, who's kind of involved in another festival, says every 6 months when the next one's coming up, he'll be asking 4 or 5 people saying, is there an age limit, can I bring my 2-year-old? And again, I think that's probably common in festivals, especially daytime festivals and across other music scenes as well. And there are organisations that have emerged. So this is a German website called Gothic Family Net, which has a sort of big sort of membership in Germany and produces kind of an online magazine, an offline magazine, various other bits and pieces, organises events, does organise a crash at some German festivals where people can leave their children. And more and more people are getting involved in it. So you've got that kind of institutionalisation, if you want to think of it that way. It's becoming part of the infrastructure of the scene almost, that now there's a significant sort of number of people that have children, and that they're still part of the scene and they need catering for somehow, or there's money to be made in catering for them, or whatever it might be. And so this is the organiser of that Gothic Family Net website. So she says, we try to connect with the scene life with the family life, because I think a lot of parents withdraw a little bit from the scene and they don't buy a lot of scene magazines. I've had parents who wrote me after their registration that they love to find something like that, as in this site, and get in contact with other parents, and they're stabilised, and so they can stay in the scene. So it becomes compatible, that they become compatible with one another, because there gradually is emerging this kind of infrastructure to cater for it. And she goes on that there are more and more parents who dare to take their children with them, for example, to the BMP Festival, because they know us, they see other families with children there. Something like that's very good for parents who don't dare to take their children. They'll see us, as in that they have a stall at that festival. They see all the children there, and then, next time I bring their child with me. And there are a lot of pregnant people today asking about next year, and so on. So again, just that sense of a sort of collective phenomenon, really, not. So when I was a little goth in the 90s, there was like 1 or 2 older people that and you knew that they had kids and stuff, but that was kind of very odd and strange, and you kind of looked up to them because they were old and they knew a lot about music and everything, but they were very much the exception. Whereas what was happening during the time that I was doing my research, which I suppose was, what was it, sort of 2010, 2011, 2012, was becoming very much normal. So, the single biggest cause of people leaving the scene in the past, people just previously would, they'd kind of stopped doing it pretty much, had started to become an integral part of the scene. And as part of that, so then this is a question, not an absolute confident assertion. My question then is the scene itself collectively, or at least parts of the scene collectively, kind of becoming a bit less transgressive and a bit more kind of aligned with dominant heteronormativity, dominant sort of notions of what adulthood is or should be? So that on the one hand, people are kind of maintaining this connection with the scene, and many people might say, aha, you're sort of holding on to your youth, refusing to become adult. But on the other hand, they are doing a number of quite typically adult things and adopting a number of quite typically adult roles. And apparently that means that the scene itself is kind of becoming more oriented in that direction too. And so, yes, I mean, the logo on this sort of says it all really. You've got these kind of alternative gothy looking people, but clearly it's kind of a bit of a nuclear sort of a family really, which is, actually, funnily enough, probably many goths would kind of say, so what, if you showed them that. But I think if you showed a whole load of goths in the 1990s that, they'd be quite surprised and think, hang on, that just isn't quite what we envisaged when we got involved in this thing. I don't know, that's speculation, but I suspect so. So I tried to talk to people quite a lot who were parents about how they brought up their kids and whether they felt that their bringing up of their kids was sort of distinctive and whether that was distinctive because they were in the goth scene, and did they have a different experience because their parents were goths and they hung around in goth festivals sometimes and that kind of thing. Most of them actually were very quite sort of almost defensive on that and sort of very keen to emphasise how normal their children were as compared to other children, possibly in anticipation of possible criticism that they might envisage might come their way, I guess. So this is like quite typical. So I'm sort of saying, are there any ways that you think, it's kind of the upbringing or your parenting or anything is different because you're involved in the goth scene? So Megan says, no, not really. I mean, yeah, she's got the occasional outfit, which if we were to go anywhere, i.e. a goth event, she could sort of dress up as a goth. But the majority of her wardrobe, I have to say, is quite definite mainstream sort of stuff. What all the other kids are into. I know my neighbours next door have children, but I wouldn't say I'm any different with Gemma as a parent than they are with their children. That was sort of a very sort of typical response. Eventually, you'll see later, there were one or two things people said that might be slightly distinct, but largely that was the kind of response really. No, it's not any different. Actually, what we're doing here is just what normal parents do, kind of thing. How am I doing for time? Just
got another
10 minutes?
Yeah,
something like that. Cool.
Yeah, right.
Okay. There was also just kind of some signs of kind of a disjunct or break, a split between the kind of family-oriented goths and the kind of more fetishistic, sexually transgressive side of the scene, which obviously makes sense, I guess, if you think about it. So Sibyl here is the Gothic Family Net person again. She says, it's only a few weeks ago that a mother actually put an advertisement for a special BDSM party. And I said, sorry, it's nice you're doing it, have fun, but I don't think it worked with our idea. In other words, they didn't want to display that kind of thing on their website or their stall. If it's too sexual, then you can't work with that. We're doing some scene markets, a special club in Duisburg, and so we have some other stalls there. And even there, I tell them to have a look what they put on their desk and withdraw extremer things. So there's sort of sense, there's like a sort of notion of family friendliness then that's sort of coming into the scene, which is sort of quite interesting. And again, it sort of makes sense, and then that sort of makes me sort of think, well, if sort of gradually the proportion of people that have children and sort of see themselves in this kind of family goth kind of a way continues to grow, then does that sort of start to have then a sort of a big impact on the younger and more transgressive sides of the scene, which it remains to be seen for sure, but it's a sort of interesting question to ask. So does that push more transgressive elements to the margins of the scene, or indeed do you get then a split completely sort of between this is the older version of the scene which has children and has careers and everything else, and this is the younger version of the scene, maybe with one or two older people who don't have kids, which is a bit more transgressive still. And I don't have a total answer to that, but again it's an interesting question. So re-embracing traditional gender roles. So another thing that, and again, this isn't representative, and so I think it's easy to sort of exaggerate things that come through in one's data and think, okay, this is a sort of real sort of trend. But there did seem, in a number of the cases that I looked at, to be a bit of a case for women, as they do in most couples, to adopt the kind of primary carer role with young children, and for them to withdraw more from the scene than their partner, who kind of carried on going out a bit more. And there were a few cases where that was the case. There were also some cases where things were far more equal, in fairness. But if there was a unevenness, it usually was that way round, if that makes sense, rather than the other way round. So in some cases, at least, I think there is a bit of a sort of a taking on of sort of fairly traditional conjugal roles, if you want to think of it that way. So John, for example, here says, yeah, when Claire was born, I don't remember Janet coming out with me, Janet's his partner. I don't believe until quite a long time afterwards that we went out together socially on a Saturday night for quite some time. I think she's so involved in the parenthood side of things that she feels like part of her isn't there anymore, and to a certain extent I think she doesn't feel she has the same energy and zest of the whole idea of getting ready to go out and so on. Whereas he was very much sort of saying that he still did and still was very, very much sort of enthusiastic to keep doing that. So, very tentatively, that was a possible thing that was happening too, I think. And there's a kind of a bit of a connection there with some studies of ageing and punk. I mentioned Andy Bennett's study at the beginning of ageing and punk. That was all sort of men in his study standing at the back of the club and so on. And most of their partners weren't there, as far as I could tell from his study anyway. And Ageing and Rave, which are a very interesting study by Julie Gregory in Canada, where she talks quite a lot about the kind of dilemmas that towards their late 20s, even some women in the rave scene had in relation to their bodies and what their bodies, the expectations about what their bodies might do later in terms of drugs, whether they should be taking drugs, whether they should be staying out all night, and all of that kind of thing, prompting some people to tone down their involvement, whereas men would tend to stay involved more intensively for longer. Also in terms of style, so this is kind of moving on to a slightly different angle, I suppose, but maybe connected. In terms of style, there was an undoubted drift towards more conservative kinds of styles of clothing, and that often entailed more of a split between the genders in terms of what they looked like. So older goths and style in relation to men, lots of people talking about, well, I just wear things that are a bit more comfortable now. I used to be like super competitive all the time, wearing lots of makeup, spending absolutely hours getting ready to go out to try and look as best as I possibly could. These days I just like to be a bit more comfortable, accept the way I am, which is a kind of interesting sort of discursive, this notion that this is just natural, whereas what I was doing previously was kind of artificial somehow, when of course what they're doing now is kind of artificial in a different way, really. And often that kind of more comfortable is kind of much more traditionally masculine looking, as you might expect. So quite often hair is cut. Sometimes people sort of grow goatee beards, that kind of thing. Much less makeup wearing, a little bit still, but less so than in the past. And people talking very interestingly about it, actually, about their body getting older and then feeling that they couldn't really carry off makeup sometimes anymore. So sometimes that kind of physical, it doesn't work, my skin's more coarse than it used to be, I'm more hairy than I used to be, whatever it might be, I'm going bald and therefore that doesn't work with the long hair makeup thing. But other people talking about sort of what's kind of appropriate for someone who's a bit older, and that this notion of kind of like an appropriate-ish sort of look for someone who's a bit of an older goth as opposed to someone who's a bit of a younger goth. So yeah, a lot of it looking a bit more masculine. So jeans, t-shirt, kind of shorter hair. Still, mostly black, kind of band t-shirt, looking sort of subcultural-ish, but not in the kind of way that those photographs I showed you earlier would look. This was a very interesting one. This would never have happened before, I'm sure it wouldn't. So I haven't done this for a while, but I might wear some eyeliner, he says, just every now and again. But Jane doesn't like lipstick on me, so I haven't worn that for a very long time. I haven't been bothered with nail varnish for a long time, and my hair will be however I decide to put it up. Otherwise it will just be I'll go out in something black, basically. Jane will make more of an effort than I will, obviously, but that's because I'm a woman, she's a woman. And I mean, I sort of laughing when I'm saying that because that's really funny to me because I used to be a goth as well, and like the whole thing was like everyone took 3 hours to get ready, whether they were male or female, and that was like one of the whole appeals of the goth scene. So it's quite interesting to see that kind of women then they're just getting ready and men don't type thing. Again, of course, not all men probably spent quite that long, but an awful lot of them did. So yeah, again, maybe just a sort of falling back into sort of a slightly more traditional roles, I guess. In terms of women, quite similar discourse about sort of wearing what's comfortable. I just wear what's comfortable, and again, sort of not competitive as I used to be. A lot of people talking about wearing sort of looser fitting clothes, and again, sort of talking sometimes about their body changing and then feeling more comfortable in looser fitting stuff. Slightly longer skirts, slightly more covering of the body than was the case before. And there also emerges a number of people talking about, and I think this mostly was women, although sometimes it was men, talking about other older goths or older women who were not realising that they were older and were still trying to wear younger clothes, and that being kind of problematic somehow. So Jane says you can sit there and look at somebody on the dance floor and think, oh my god, do I look like that when I wear similar things? You know, they're all gyrating and things and they look all wobbly and something, and they've squeezed into this PVC and everything's bulging over the sides, etc., etc. Lots of people saying things like that. And so, yeah, there emerges this notion of that, you know, we're all still involved in goth and that's cool, and we kind of think that we're a bit cool and rebellious because of that and everything, and we probably are a little bit. But there is a kind of way of doing goth if you're a bit older, which is kind of adult appropriate. And I suppose, again, it sort of so happens that way is kind of a little bit more kind of gender normal, maybe, even if it still does look a bit transgressive. So in general, there's that. So alongside the parenthood and the way that that's changing things, there's also this kind of embrace of slightly more conservative types of style, which are a little bit more in keeping with the traditional gender roles to some extent. There is, however, I think that's probably not the end of the story. There are still various ways in which they do remain distinctive, and some of them remain very distinctive. So some of them are working extremely hard to retain a sort of very spectacular image. So this person, for example, is sort of, talking to me in some detail about, his hair's receding gradually. It's not what it used to be. Usually I wear a hat or something. Then again, I did wear a hat at 25, but now I sort of have to, as it were. And then I sort of say that, because I'm talking about his appearance, that you've found ways of sort of adapting. So hair extensions, so he sort of attaches hair extensions to his hair, and he has a sort of band over the sort of hairline, which works quite well, and he's still therefore manages to adopt this kind of very feminine look, and he wears makeup and so on too. Sorry, I should have said he would have been about sort of 32, 33 when I talked to him, I think. So, various people still making considerable effort, even amidst that broader kind of trend towards sort of making things becoming more conservative. Also, in terms of the parenthood aspect, I told you, most people sort of were at pains to point out how normal their parenting was in some ways. People did eventually start to talk a little bit about sort of aspects that their kids might get that they might not get if they weren't sort of involved in the scene. And this has also been talked about by other people. So Nicola Smith has done a really interesting sort of chapter on Northern Soul, the Northern Soul scene in mostly sort of Lancashire, that kind of area, her research at least. And she talks about the passing on of the subculture from generation to generation and taking kids out, and then eventually the kids kind of take on the scene and so on. So they're sort of socialised into it, and they have all of this kind of subcultural capital, as it were, right from the start. I wasn't quite getting that as strongly as she did, I don't think, but I was getting an element of this sort of thing. So I don't think, in some respects, Karen won't bat an eyelid at men in makeup, or there's lots of people she won't bat an eyelid at, if that makes sense. So lots of people talking about, they're always in this sort of environment where people are wearing this weird stuff, and some people are still wearing this sort of really quite extreme fetishistic stuff as well, and they're just sort of wandering around in those kind of environments, and that maybe might make a difference to the way in which they grow up and so on. So elements of distinctiveness, even amidst the changes. And, there is a real market for kind of goth babies' clothes and goth children's clothes, as you can imagine. Okay, so I'm pretty much done. Obviously, the case of aging goth that's not necessarily typical of other sexually transgressive youth subcultures. And in fact, another study, a specific study of the queer scene in Brisbane by Jodie Taylor, she kind of argues the opposite in the case of that particular scene, that it represents a kind of ongoing challenge to the heteronormative life course. In this case, people aren't having kids, in most cases at least, and they're continuing to go out as late as they always did, and well into their 30s, and continuing to retain that kind of queer identity. There may be a difference that in that case the whole scene is centred around queerness, and that's the sort of core sort of focus of the scene, which is slightly different than in the case of goth. Nevertheless, I think the studies, so obviously sort of shows how subcultural identities can be retained, and retained sometimes quite strongly through adulthood. But, crucially, that might not always infer a rejection of dominant adult values and roles. So I suppose one of the questions I started with when I first started researching it is, how should we understand these people? Should we understand these people as people... is it like an extension of youth, that these people are holding on to their youth, retaining their youth and youthfulness? Or should we understand them as adopting a different form of adulthood? Or should we understand them as adopting basically the same form of adulthood, but with a different look? And I think it's probably somewhere between the latter two categories. And I'll leave it there.